That's just setting up now. All right, guys. Hello, everyone. My name is Danny from the OECD Washington Center. Thank you all for bearing with us. We just had I myself had a slight tech difficulty making sure that we were streaming on our Facebook page, but thank you so much for joining us today for the second OECD Washington Center DC Global Shapers Future of Work Interactive Dialogue Series event. The title of today's event is Redesigning the Pipeline, Examining a Future of Work that is Purpose-Driven. As mentioned, my name is Danny Ryan from the OECD Washington Center, and it's great to have you here today with such an esteemed panel. Our goal with these webinars is to discuss the policies, ideas, and actions that are shaping the future of work. Throughout this series, we will discuss reskilling, automation, entrepreneurship, education, and much more. For the first time ever, the OECD is putting young people at the heart of this discussion with our recently launched youth consultation, which aims to provide tools to better understand these issues and contribute to the conversation. So if you are between 15 and 30, whatever your current situation or background may be, we would love it if you would share your thoughts with us by taking part in the survey. Your opinions and ideas will help shape the OECD's advice to future policymakers. This series also supports the World Economic Forum's Davos Labs initiative, topic area of economy. We will post links to both of these campaigns in the chat. I want to give a big thank you to the DC Global Shapers for their enormous contribution to this series and for being such a brilliant partner. And we're looking forward to continuing our work with them. We hope you enjoy today's event, and do please check out our next two webinars. Finally, as an Irishman, I would just like to wish you all a very happy and safe St. Patrick's Day. With that being said, it gives me enormous pleasure to hand over to Deloris Wilson, founder and principal of Axel Impact Studio and a global shaper. Deloris, thank you so much for being here today and for moderating the session going forward. I now hand over all responsibility over to you. Deloris.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Danny, and such a pleasure to be here. It's so great to see the panelists. I can't see the audience, but I appreciate the smiles and the energy that you're sending my way. Again, my name is Deloris Wilson. I'm the founder and principal of Axel Impact Studio and a proud member of the DC Global Shapers. And this dialogue is a part of our OECD DC Global Shapers Future of Work Dialogue series. And we're really focused today on talking about how do we create a future of work that is purpose-driven? What are we thinking about as we support entrepreneurship, inclusive entrepreneurship, as well as entrepreneurship within corporations, in addition to a more beneficial and socially impactful corporate entity. As we move through COVID recovery, as we increasingly move through an interconnected society, we have to think about how all these different controls are impacting entrepreneurial development. And I'm really excited for the panelists that we have here today that breadth from policy to social impact to entrepreneurship to ecosystem building to share their experiences and insights on this issue. Unfortunately, Claire Sal was not able to join us today, but if you do follow her online, she is very much involved, especially in supporting technology ecosystems, and I encourage you to follow her work as well. So before we begin, I just want to set a little bit of the stage around what do we mean by purpose when we say creating a future of work that is purpose-driven. I frame purpose in two ways. Purpose meaning the intentional design of entrepreneurial supports. How are we being intentional in inclusive innovation and inclusive entrepreneurship? But also how are we being purposeful in the actual structure of these businesses, whether they are a B Corp or they have a double bottom line or mission driven. And our panelists will be able to speak to both of those today. To begin, I'm going to quickly just do a round of interviews, just the first line of these amazing folks' bios before we get into an introductory presentation by Jonathan Potter at OECD. And that will be followed by a few questions that I'll moderate, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So who we have on the stage with us today, Emmanuel Gamor, who is an ecosystem builder and hosts Unpacking Africa podcast. He is also a global shaper, an avid advocate for inclusive entrepreneurship, especially in terms of upskilling and reskilling for digital ecosystems. We also have Marissa Davis, who is the founder of Talawa Consulting and also a social entrepreneur. She has extensive experience in advising corporations on impact-driven strategies, most recently for WeWork, as we know, is a conglomerate and supporter of startup enterprises and brings a US perspective to the conversation. And last but not least, we have Jonathan Potter, who is the head of entrepreneurship policy and analysis at OECD, who will set the stage on what is working, what isn't working, and what should we be thinking about as we advise policies and institutional supports for entrepreneurship. So I'm going to now take a pause and send it over to Jonathan to lead us in our first presentation, and then we'll join us back for conversation in about 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. I'm going to take you through a little presentation here about redesigning the pipeline, and I'm taking that as being the pipeline of new businesses that we need to come through, developing these double bottom lines and these mission-driven ventures. We probably need to start with some basic points about entrepreneurship. I think most of this is not contested. It's all well known, but it's not really shouted about enough. The benefits of entrepreneurship. There's a lot of evidence out there. Entrepreneurship is supporting innovation. It supports competition. It keeps existing incumbent firms on their toes. It contributes to productivity growth, to the majority of new job creations coming through new enterprises. Contributes to social cohesion, at least if the entrepreneurship is inclusive. And now what we're thinking about is how do we respond to COVID-19, which has taken out a lot of the small business stock. And what we need to respond to COVID-19 is new entries now to fill the gaps, but not just to replace the same that we had before, but to take us to a more sustainable, greener economy. These are the benefits, of course. But there are some big barriers to entrepreneurship that governments are progressively starting to recognize. And you can put them in two areas: the barriers in terms of institutions, in terms of culture, in terms of people's behavior, people's attitudes. You have got instilled, particularly in certain places, old industrial regions, for example, cultures which don't recognize the value of entrepreneurship. A lack of networks, business networks, for people to get resources and ideas, regulatory frameworks that are punitive of the new starter with the amount of bureaucracy they need to go through. And of course, entrepreneurs, they need finance. That's recognized. There's a big market failure. Skills, ideas, premises, access to resources, these can be important problems. Some entrepreneurs get through, others don't get through this. And this is why we need policy support. So essentially, entrepreneurship policy is needed to build this pipeline, which is the title of our event, of future entrepreneurs and successful startups. What I'm going to do is talk to you about a report that you can download and you can read online from the OECD. Give you an example of the sort of scheme that we think is a very good scheme and we need to see a lot more of around the world, and some next steps for policymakers from our point of view at the OECD. So let's take the report. This is it. It's the OECD's International Compendium of Entrepreneurship Policies. It's a volume which shows the types of entrepreneurship policy that governments are producing. It talks about the rationale for entrepreneurship policy. Why do we need it? There are some that argue that we don't need it. It caters to special interest groups. It's not needed. Why do we need it? It's because of those problems I mentioned. We give examples of good practice policies that can be inspiration for policymakers. We identify in this report some pitfalls and some success factors, and we talk about how to evaluate. So how do we evaluate that a policy is effective? This is all in this publication. Now, what could be interesting is to use this distinction in the report between three different kinds of entrepreneurship policy. So there are the policies that try and improve the institutional conditions. These are policies that make it easier to start a business, the number of registration processes that you need to get through. There are also measures you can take to improve cultures, to present role models, to make entrepreneurs look more realizable for you. Then you've got programs that are targeted direct onto specific entrepreneurs or enterprises that seek to help them to get knowledge, to get finance, to get networks. And then there are policies that could be at the level of a country or at the level of a region or a state or a city to build entrepreneurial ecosystems, the entrepreneurial ecosystem builders. Inside of the report, we give 16 examples of different policies across the different OECD countries. We have 37 member countries. We've got 16 policies picked out from them that fall into one of those three categories. I can't go clearly through all of that now. You can read it, you know, measures to reduce the tax burden for those enterprises that set up in distressed urban areas. The equivalent of your opportunity zone type of thing in France is an example. The Entrepreneur's Desk in Portugal that helps to navigate through regulations. The incubator initiatives and the accelerator initiatives. We've got examples of all of these in the report. And in fact, what we do, which is neat, I think, is for each of the programs, like here, the regional business development centers in Denmark, we sort of tick which good practice that program illustrates. So we've gone through and we've identified what makes for successful policy. A successful policy sets out a goal, an objective clearly. It involves the stakeholders in deciding what the goal of that policy is. It raises awareness of the existence of the program amongst the target group. All of these things are here on my slide. You see all these good practice factors. And so you can dip into the report and you can see what factors are being illustrated by what programs. But here is one case. It's from the United States, in fact. It's not a government policy, strictly speaking. It's run by a non-governmental organization called venturecapital.org, which is based in Utah and has spread a little bit over the boundary. It's not a big program. It's only got an annual budget of $300,000 US dollars, which is very small for typical entrepreneurship policies of governments. But it is actually being very clever in harnessing a lot of in-kind resources and time of volunteers. And what it's doing is it's trying to overcome some of these obstacles with coaching, with mentoring, and with networking for the entrepreneurs. And what it's really trying to do is get these enterprises with innovative ideas through the valley of death, which is the period in which they're making expenditures in prototyping, in finding their customers, and they're not getting the revenues. That's the valley of death, and trying to help them to get financing to get them over that period, and also to identify other resources that might help them, like suppliers, like key customers, like legal support, IP, intellectual property. So to create connections and networks and get the funding. The rationale, of course, the first-time entrepreneur is lacking knowledge and lacking networks, and this is where they can help. What they call it is collaborative mentoring. But to start off with, they select companies that they believe do have strong growth potential. They don't address all companies, and they don't have to be unicorns. They have to have some growth potential. And then these companies are offered mentoring by volunteers, qualified volunteers. They've been chief financial officers, they've been chief executive officers of companies. 4 to 8 mentors per team, per company, per entrepreneur. So you get a nice wide panel, 5 to 6 1-hour sessions, virtual, so not too expensive, twice a week, so regular, get the momentum. The focus is really on a purpose, which is a pitch. You're going to make a pitch to potential investors. So let's get your story right. They also have these investor liaisons, which are college students who come in and support the whole mentoring process. And of course, they learn whilst they're doing that. And they might pick up some positive attitudes to entrepreneurship and some positive knowledge. And then there's the pitching event itself, the deal forum, where you finally get up and you present to this diverse panel of potential funders 4 times a year. There's also much bigger events like the Investor Choice Conference. So they say 60 to 70% going through this get the funding that they want. They make adjustments to their business plans. They get links to other sources of support. So that's nearly it from me. But the last thing is, well, the next steps for policymakers in our view. First, of course, recognize the importance of what we call productive entrepreneurship. Particularly productive entrepreneurship right now when we have to restore the economy from this COVID-19 shock. Entrepreneurship is key. Governments have got to put their resources behind it now. Then experiment with new policy initiatives like the ones that we document in our report in the compendium. But it's not one silver bullet. This is not a one silver bullet area. This is where you need a package, a combination of measures going across the institutions, the ecosystems, and those specific areas of resources. So put those things together, get the policy delivery right. That's very important. In the very detailed design and implementation, you do have to select the right participants. Imagine that scheme. They have to get the right people going through. You have to raise awareness of all those who might benefit that it's there. Link in with existing centers like the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. Don't try and do it all alone, and monitor as well the impacts. And the final point, one of our key points that we always make, that you have to evaluate your impacts. A, to know what works, and B, to justify that governments and others would come in and place resources in this type of scheme. So delighted to be in your debate about purpose-driven future of work. Those are the details for more information.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for your research and remarks, and also for setting a wonderful stage so that we can understand and get on the same language around what are the inputs and controls and influences that support thriving entrepreneurship. So I'd love to pitch it over to our panelists, beginning with Emmanuel, to discuss your background, your involvement in entrepreneurship ecosystem building, your perspectives and observations that you've seen as we're transitioning into COVID recovery, and what business looks like on the other side of this.
Excellent. No, thank you so much, Deloris, and thank you, Jonathan, for setting the stage as well. And I think quite a bit of what's, or how I'll be framing mine as entrepreneurship based in the global South, specifically on the African continent. I'll be looking at regions, West Africa and South Africa, and I'll be sharing on what resilience looks like in these contexts, but also the need for ecosystem building. I think I liked, and a couple of the slides that Jonathan shared, there was a need for understanding, particularly for policymakers and other stakeholders, being empathetic to the need of the entrepreneur. And I think these are things that we cannot take for granted, particularly on the African continent, especially when a lot of entrepreneurial initiatives have such a large impact. Almost every business that is created out here impacts communities, creates opportunities for families, and really drives economic growth that we would love to see in various countries. In South Africa, I have a startup with the Chimalahong precinct, Educania, and it's been one of the ways that we one, adopt digital, understand the opportunity of using tech more as a tool rather than just a means to an end, and being able to more or less create a structure where both the teams within companies understand that tech is malleable, that technology in of itself can also be African owned, could be African co-created, and most importantly, the factory setting stock for any technology, be it the equipment and mobile phone use, of which is quite popular. There are quite a number of statistics out there for your global audience, those in the United States. You would hear a couple of stats about how accessible cell phones and a lot of technology around mobile phone, access to credit, mobile phone payments, and ways in which folks have built resilience during lockdown because of the COVID situation has been through the use of mobile phone technology to communicate relevant information, to be able to have access to supplies, to be able to do things like shopping and have delivery and connect to courier services, which usually are what my Nigerian friends would call Okada or motorcycles, especially in last mile delivery services. There's actually another project that I'm really passionate about that speaks more holistically around ecosystem building, and it looks at something that I think a lot of people can relate to is the on-trend or on-brand narrative about Africa and arts and culture. So Ghana hosted the Year of the Return. If you're a fan of Grammys and Afrobeats, Wizkid, as well as Burna Boy, Tiwa Savage, also Anati helped co-write some songs, collaborations with Beyonce, and The Lion King, the soundtrack to that movie had a lot of African artists, African creatives receiving Grammy nominations, almost, if you will, one of the global standards for creative acknowledgements or awards. Beyond that, we've seen quite a bit of a renaissance, if you will, with Sir David Ajayi, who an architect, a British Ghanaian architect who created the African American Museum and continues to create landmark infrastructure as well, and challenging kind of conventional thinking around spaces like architecture, and the need to appreciate and bring African creative arts and cultures to the forefront in a way that one is commercialized hasn't been more urgent. And so launched an LEU gift hub in Accra with the intention of creating a creative arts village that allows quite a bit of what Jonathan also shared, which is very interesting, the idea of cooperative support and being intentional about not just cash investments, but in-kind support, things like mentorship, opportunities for creatives to have access to exchange programs, opportunities for on-the-spot entrepreneurs to be able to practice things like buying and selling through flea markets, community engagement, opportunities to understand what sustainable ingredients look like, and most importantly, opportunities for folks to be able to place higher value to local products and services. In February, there was a report that came out from We the People as well as MasterCard, and it shared the opportunity that digitization, access to funding, and access to foreign currency can do in increasing the revenue streams by 6.5 times those who are in the artisan or creative manufacturing sector. So I'm really excited about the things that are happening, and hopefully as we continue to talk, I'll be leaning in on my experience and the work that I'm doing in these spaces and how we've been able to build resilience and an outlook for the future, especially for entrepreneurs on the African continent.
Thank you so much, Emmanuel. So many great points that we'll thread on in just a bit. I want to pitch it over to Marissa to talk through your perspective, especially in advising corporations on how they are creating impact-driven models that could support many of the initiatives that Emmanuel mentioned, but also continue to spur impact-driven entrepreneurship. So what have you observed in your experience?
Yeah, so first, thank you all for this time and this really, I think, timely conversation. There are a couple of things that come to mind for me. One, both in terms of working with companies as they're trying to figure out how to prioritize social impact in this moment, but also I'm holding the other hat as well of teaching social entrepreneurship and some of the what's coming up, within that space. So I will start with just the work of, working with a range of companies that, especially within this time, are trying to think about how to not only prioritize social impact, but also, especially within the context of, the racial reckoning that, at least here in the US, we've been dealing with since the murder of George Floyd, how to prioritize inclusion and equity at the same time. And so what I'm seeing is a range of companies that are trying to figure that out, right? There have been series of commitments, monetary commitments that have been made to some of the bigger companies. You're hearing several millions of dollars being put aside to be able to support Black and brown businesses, entrepreneurs. But for me, what that is looking like is also expanding the conversation to how this kind of concretely, what these companies might think about in the very design of products and services they have, right? So there's a lot of conversation around supporting these various entrepreneurs, existing Black and brown businesses. But for me, another part of that is how these companies are prioritizing. For example, a bank is thinking about developing financial products that are more affordable and beneficial to some of the customer base that they have, as well as some of the Black and brown social entrepreneurs that they have. This is also manifesting itself in companies that are trying to establish social innovation facilities or centers, within the structure of what they already have. Barclays, for example, created a social innovation facility that is trying to harness what I would say is more the entrepreneurship, sort of taking the entrepreneurial principles and applying that more internally to how they think about designing better products that are reaching some of their customers that have historically been on the margins. So when I think about, the context of entrepreneurship and where that fits, it's certainly, yes, within the space of equipping, particularly from my end, Black and brown businesses that are doing the work and trying to be needing the resources, both in terms of capital and network. But for me, there's a second piece to that is around applying more of an entrepreneurial mindset internally within some of these companies for there to be even more dedicated focus and intention around bringing together being more intentional about inclusion, equity, and impact. And finally, what I'll say in terms of just the education bit, I have many students who haven't even heard of social entrepreneurship for the first time, when I teach. And these are largely Black and brown students. And so I think there's tremendous opportunity in the future to actually be focused on entrepreneurial education within the classroom at an earlier time period, not even college, even before high school, such that they're even ready once they're graduating to be able to even see an entrepreneurial pathway as a viable option for them. So I think I will end there, and certainly happy to lean more into the conversation just from that lens as we continue to discuss.
Yeah, thank you so much. Your her question or your point about education is something that we definitely want to pull back in. I'm going to take a slight pivot to bring us all in the conversation before directing questions your way. I want to talk about how there's a difference in supports around startups versus traditional small businesses. This was prevalent before COVID-19, and it has remained such that, you know, there is popularity, there's energy, there is excitement, and there are massive amounts of money invested into technology startups because we know of their potential. They're job creators, they are innovators, they're scaling tremendously. But we also know the micro enterprises are keeping people's lights on. The micro enterprises are allowing folks to express their passions, to care for their families, to make ends meet when their full-time job is not necessarily providing for them, or they are experiencing wage gaps and pay gaps that are prevalent across the US. So based on you all's observations, looking at startups versus small businesses, where are we driving economic recovery efforts, and should we readjust? Have you noticed this? And if so, what's your take on it?
Absolutely. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, no, you started.
Sure. I'll just take up that space. I think one of the philosophies that's been incredibly important that we've realized in building resilience is looking at some of these global macro interventions more at the community level. And one of the things that was personally highlighted when the pandemic happened was the double whammy of locked borders and closed access to economic interventions. So if you're in a community that didn't manufacture PPEs, for example, or if you didn't have a community that you were living in that had logistics supply chains, groceries, and others, you saw that there were communities that were literally having food crises, were literally having economic or exacerbated economic downturn in addition to a health crisis. And so the paradigm shift needs to happen where you look at, yes, there is something to having large swaths of policy interventions, large things. A good example could be the SDGs and rallying things that we're doing, but we also need to look at community interventions and say, what does a community that we're in, that we live in, need to survive? These type of things that we talked about, and it was sad to learn about during the time that COVID-19 came, was we face these almost once in every generation, but these type of situations where either health crises or conflict, et cetera, that we see happening are not uncommon, but we've not built that community resilience. And I think one of the most important things that I still haven't seen highlighted, brought to the fore, is to encourage us to have communities that are a bit more self-sufficient, especially on the essentials, in terms of health, in terms of transmission of education, in terms of access to internet and other things, so that we build more community resilience as we move forward.
Yeah, I think, so I was just going to add to that, you know, when thinking about community resilience, even just to the point that Emmanuel was making, in particular within the US context, I think another part of this conversation is just capital, right? And how it is being accessed and funneled. So you take, for example, this dichotomy, or so it's the binary between small businesses and startups. I mean, just within 2020 alone, I think the VC funding and landscape increased, I think, by 14% relative to 2019, whereas for small businesses, largely Black and brown small businesses, I think it's been close to 50 or 60% of them have been closed by now. And what I am seeing is a disparity, right? So it isn't that there isn't capital available, it's just, it's not available in specific places, right? So just thinking about what I see is just this idea of even taking the concept or what is kind of dominant in the VC spaces and shifting or redistributing that to what we're seeing or labeling as small businesses or micro enterprises. I mean, there have been so many Black and brown businesses who tried to apply for PPE loans and funding and didn't even have access to that, right? So what does it look like to partner with community-based entities that many of these small businesses are already connected to, and have there be some kind of funnel for additional capital that they're able to access, especially in times like these, so that they're able to not have to, get into the little savings that they probably have, because many of these businesses, largely for Black and brown businesses, if it's not coming from private loans that they're going after, it's literally being funded independently. They're bootstrapping. So, I think in the same way that there's a bit of latitude or kind of flexibility for folks in the VC space to just get funding to even validate an idea, thinking about what that looks like to reshift the essence of that and adapt that to the small business and kind of micro enterprise space, particularly for Black and brown businesses.
Yeah, absolutely. This actually has me thinking. There was a tweet, and unfortunately I can't credit it to the author, but there is a tweet that went viral some months ago, and it says something to the effect of, Black entrepreneurs don't need any more mentors. Every program wants to pair us with a mentor, wants to give us in-kind support. We need capital. And that capital will unlock the resources, the attachments, the relationships that can help elevate and advance these companies. A second point I wanted to bring out, Marissa, something that you said earlier around the concept of education and exposure and understanding, these are viable options for careers, for pursuits. And this really connected to Jonathan's earlier conversation around the cultural aspect of entrepreneurship. Some cultures, recognize the value, some may not, some have access to understanding those markets, some have not had that exposure. I want to bring in an example around an organization, a nonprofit that actually is very much in this work of culturally transforming our perception of and access to entrepreneurship. And that's HBCU VC, which is one of the few nonprofits in the venture capital space that's working to expose and support students at predominantly Black colleges and universities, but also at broader universities as well, to pursue careers in venture capital and tech entrepreneurship. And that integrates culturally informing education. It integrates the placement and advice from investors and entrepreneurs that look like them, that come from their communities, that started off, in the very same space, but were able to move their career forward using different opportunities and taking advantage of them. And so when I think about, this idea of how do we design supports that actually work, it very much is meeting people where they are. It's not, designing from 50,000 feet above what we understand to be the needs of a business, but it's really the needs of a person. And how does that community function? What interventions do we need to have? And how can we match that support to that culture? So Jonathan, I'd love to get your dig a little bit deeper into this kind of cultural aspect of ecosystem building and how we can design supports that reflect the needs of particular communities, as opposed to a more, blanket application of what we understand to be successful business or successful business development.
Yeah, how to design support for particular communities is it's a tricky question, because there's an argument that is often put that we create our government support for all businesses, and that there therefore is no need for anything specific for women businesses, or for youth businesses, or for what we call ethnic minority businesses in Europe. So but the problem is that actually we don't even have the information on the take up of those programs by these different populations, because it's not systematically collected. But of course, we strongly suspect that many of the public programs that are there to provide finance and advice and other things to entrepreneurs are actually going in majority to the mainstream population. And there are things that are making it not accessible to some of the populations who you definitely need involved if you're going to have inclusive growth. Now, what you can do about it then, I think there's at least a couple of things you can do right from the top. Is you can involve diverse groups, stakeholders in the upfront design of programs. That's one thing. And really deliberately set out to design a program that meets the needs of different groups. And the second thing is this monitoring of the take-up, because if you're finding that your take-up is not representative of the population, you have to make an adjustment. Lastly, I shouldn't add one, but you can create dedicated programs for certain groups.
Thank you. Before pivoting back to the other panelists, I want to go a little bit more into this data gap, which each of us have experienced. Marissa and I, both as impact strategists and evaluating these programs, wanting to understand the needs. There is a huge international gap in our ability to understand the true problems and also evaluate the effectiveness of these programs. Can you speak to your research and experience in that area and some recommendations that you have for how we can help close this evaluation problem that we're seeing in these programs?
Yeah, I can briefly come in on that. I mean, we have an OECD guidebook on for governments on how to evaluate SME and entrepreneurship programs. The problem is, and we're updating it now, the problem is that we still observe that evaluation is rarely undertaken, despite our promotional efforts for the importance of it. And we also find that evaluation that is undertaken is rarely using robust methods. And really what we say is it's actually a fairly simple exercise to evaluate policy. You do need a treatment group and a control group, and you can get data for your treatment group and your control group from a range of sources. Governments, of course, are well placed to use tax records and social security records to trace participants versus non-participants. You can also do random control trials. Why this isn't being done more? It's getting easier and easier. The techniques are there, the data's increasingly there. We need a push on this.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I do want to acknowledge that our Q&A is open. We have about 15 minutes left. And so I'm going to weave between our Q&A and also our prepared questions. So just want to remind you all to please use the chat box if you have specific questions that you'd like to ask. Following on this line, I'd love to talk with both Marissa and Emmanuel around kind of how could we ensure that the capital that is floating right now across the world in recovery efforts is invested with equity and inclusion at its core. Do you all have particular recommendations or strategies for how we can design those investments, how we can identify the types of companies or ecosystem builder organizations in need and deserving of this funding? What could that pipeline of capital look like?
You know, I think for me, really, it literally just starts with being intentional. You know, the idea of if you just say, hey, I want to have funding that is more actually meeting intentionality with action rather. So you can say, you know, I want to be able to fund these sets of entrepreneurs or small businesses, but don't really know where to begin. The part of the intention is to kind of figure out what the next steps are actionably to do that. And I think that rests with just asking questions, like trying to find the existing hubs and networks where some of these entrepreneurs and businesses may already be. So even just from what I mentioned at the top of our conversation, if you're working with, if you're looking at community centers, for example, or even historically Black colleges and universities, or chambers of commerce, to what Jonathan had mentioned earlier, thinking about those networks as places to start, I think is an important place to begin. So not just coming up with the idea of let's just build from scratch, actually working from the existing networks that are there. And that has to be, with asking the right questions and just being intentional about speaking with people who are already plugged into those spaces.
Great, thank you. Emmanuel?
Yeah, I think what I would share might sound a bit not necessarily contrarian, but definitely revolutionary. But not even that. But it's
We need that.
in my opinion more economics than anything, right? So this is my view on intentional investing in ways that diverse organizations can have access to capital. It's really creating and recalibrating a world trade global system where global South gets value for the things we produce, right? Because if you look at it, what we need to do is to build an asset class of diverse people who can represent diverse ideas, stand for it, and be shareholders in that space. And the reason why it's so skewed is because there are so many barriers of having an asset class that can do an example of what Jonathan just presented, right? The example from the United States having, even if the ticket items are 300K, you do need and want folks who are in Guinea-Bissau, who understand Guinea-Bissau's government economic practices, to be investing in businesses that are, or ideas coming from Guinea-Bissau. The idea that we constantly have to kowtow to make our businesses look like, plead for, and ask for space is incredibly challenging, right? And one of the things that isn't very painful, I used to, and I do some consulting work for a lot of innovation spaces. I've worked with impact hubs, a lot of standard banks hubs, a lot of hubs that were sponsored by Google. The language and the metric used for access to credit and finance, asking why aren't there more diverse groups in a Y Combinator and others, comes down to trust. And when you break that down and you say, okay, somebody's saying that they cannot trust your idea and to make an investment or to have you at the seat of the table, then and it's a very deep, almost arbitrary thing. You're saying you just don't trust this. Then a good way to attack this problem holistically is allow folks who trust their communities, who have inbuilt trust, specifically for diverse groups, to be able to be in an asset class to build for those. And when you create, and you may not need quantitative or qualitative analysis, but when you create diverse group innovation and diverse products that serve different spaces, the world becomes better. We don't need to be dependent on an American-centric, German-centric, European-centric access to innovative technology, and that runs the gamut from agriculture all the way to finance. We need diverse solutions that then we have learning practices. So I think for me, again, I don't think it's overly revolutionary. It may sound uncomfortable to some folks, but we do need to be intentional about improving the asset class of diverse people and then allowing them to be the ones who take the reins, apply the mentorship, add empathy, and foster that trust that seems to be the buzzword thrown around for why we're not getting capital in certain spaces.
Absolutely. You bring up such phenomenal points, and something that I want to bring out in relationship to that is this notion of regulation and expectation of performance or outcomes or metrics, which government requires, which programs require, which funders require on paper. But in actuality, this is a relational conversation. This is a trust conversation. This is a proximity conversation. And 9 times out of 10, the money that is invested, particularly in the venture capital space, especially for early stage companies or seed stage companies, to get you over that initial hump from an idea to a proof of concept, is very much so directed by trust and relationships, not by metrics. But the expectation is for Black and brown folks in particular, the performance and outcomes are held to a higher degree of formality. In which case, it's not even in alignment with where the business is developing at the time. So when we're looking at kind of all these different controls in an ecosystem, from policy to private investors to institutions to educational institutions, Marissa, how you brought up that very good point, to your lone singular ecosystem builders, it truly is a network of connection and support that has to be aligned across the scale. And Emmanuel, you brought that point up so clearly, in this need of this asset class that is empowering those who do trust, who do have the networks, have the information, have the experience and the relationships in those markets to drive those outcomes. So just in closing, sorry, go ahead, please.
I was going to say, and just to add on to that, part of this is not even just thinking about the, who is funneling the funding, right? That is an important part of the conversation, absolutely. But part of it, even to what you were just saying, is just changing the very process, in how it actually happens. So even just some of the reporting structure, to your point, this is not specific to just the VC space. This is in philanthropy. This is in lots of other areas where funding and capital is involved, where there are individuals who are creating sort of the milestones, for goals that is tied to dollars that's not necessarily aligned with the on-the-ground work that is being done by the entrepreneurs, by the social impact professionals that are in the space. And so what I've been seeing, even just within the philanthropic space, has been a redesigning of the process itself that is involving listening more to those on the ground, to have a power sharing dynamic to it as well, where there is a better process for reporting that is more aligned and honest to the actual needs of the folks at the end, the entrepreneurs and the communities that are being served, right? So I definitely think that is an important thing to also kind of think about within the context of this conversation.
Well,
And we're seeing that. Please go.
Sorry, thank you. I just wanted to give a reference point for your audience, and also to add kind of a data point to what I was saying. Silicon Savannah has been something that has been pushed, particularly in Kenya, and the idea of so many startups that are African from a robust kind of ecosystem that's built in Kenya. And in 2018, there was a lot of fear, because if you looked at a lot of the ticket items and venture capital that was being invested in Kenya, Africa, it was to companies that had a specifically white co-founder. And so you end up seeing what I was saying being expressed, and folks can Google this. You can check out GSM has some data on funders. Britta Bridges, a colleague that worked with at Impact Hub, has put out consistent reports that shows the ticket items on which sectors, which companies, and most importantly, whittles it down to the type of funders that are getting that. So you can see that there's an inbuilt bias, and it's really harsh, because when you're thinking of the large, maybe what Jonathan would describe as the general population of those on the African continent, we're not predominantly white funders. So that's something that at data point I wanted to leave your listeners with in order to interrogate as well.
Thank you. And so we do have about 2 minutes left. I want to be respectful of folks' time. As we close, I'd love if each of you could provide your perspective on where do we go from here? What are you excited about? What are you aimed towards? What is your vision for the future? I'm a proponent that we don't need any more studies on what we don't have, on what we lack, on the problems. We understand and have so much data to prove where these inequities are, their source of them, and it's time to design for anew while holding accountable what has happened to date. And so my vision for the future is one where we are focused on designing solutions by those who have experienced the problems, by putting ourselves in those positions of power and influence over the capital that's invested in them, and creating a world where those who have been most extracted from are poured into and are leaders in their own right. And are able to dictate their own futures. And so I'd love to hear from each of you. What is your vision? What are you working towards? What's motivating you to keep moving through this work?
Well, one, I would echo a good bit of what you just said, Deloris, in terms of, where we should be funneling our focus and efforts. But I would add to that, that one, we think about looking at different areas geographically, that maybe we haven't looked at before, and I'll speak just specifically to the US, that places where we might not have typically invested or seen, a proper space for entrepreneurs being there, like even here in New York, not just looking at, 57th Street and below, but Harlem and Queens and parts of Brooklyn, like looking at those areas to find the right kinds of entrepreneurs that are being overlooked just because of their zip code. So that is one thing. That is one thing I envision for the future, that we just reshift where we're focusing and who we're focusing on. And then the second piece is just an echoing of something that I mentioned before, just the education piece of just letting people seeing and knowing that entrepreneurship and social entrepreneurship in particular, because that is my area, that is a viable pathway. And so I think I saw Susan's question. Yes, it's starting early, like even from high school and college, just thinking about how to understand entrepreneurship and how to take entrepreneurial approaches and mindsets and apply that to work that they're doing, whether or not these young people end up being entrepreneurs themselves or end up being working within companies and end up being social entrepreneurs. So those are the two things I think that I would leave you all with.
Thank you. Emmanuel or Jonathan? Oh, Jonathan, I think you're
I'm sorry. I think that it's one thing that's very important is actually selectivity in policy support. We haven't spoken about it so much, but we do have to. It came up with the SME versus startup, and it came up with the micro. You do have to recognize that a lot of new businesses, when they start, they go on to fail. You have to recognize that micro enterprises have low productivity in general. There are a small number, a small proportion of startups that go on to be successful and that are innovative. It's only a small proportion. It doesn't have to be high growth. It doesn't have to be gazelle. It doesn't have to be unicorn. I'm not talking about massive growth, but it has to go on to employ more than the founder. It's those sorts of businesses that we need to help, those with some sort of growth ambition. So I think there has to be some selectivity.
Thank you. Excellent point. And Emmanuel, to close us out.
Thank you. Part of it, in terms of how I see the ecosystem playing out, I think I had the chance and privilege to teach in Mauritius at African Leadership University on entrepreneurial leadership, and realized we need a lot more touch points than just in classroom for people to understand and appreciate the value of the economy, to appreciate and negotiate the world of work where we're putting forth our productivity, whether to be entrepreneurs within companies that we support or aligned with, social enterprises and others, or becoming entrepreneurs where we're being at the vanguard of testing innovations and making it commercial for communities. I think that we need to be intentional. I also think that there needs to be an audaciousness, particularly from diverse groups. I think because we seem to be coming into the entrepreneurial conversation or the industrial conversation late, we don't seem to have an audaciousness and ownership of it. But the truth with the pandemic is, and which was actually fascinating just hearing folks deal with vaccines versus vaccination delivery. Last mile delivery is incredibly hard. Logistics and supplies are incredibly hard. Creating interventions for people that are impact driven and led, to our earlier points about almost every enterprise business on the African continent is impact driven and led because of some of the lack of infrastructure. So if the US finds it difficult, even with all that infrastructure, you can imagine what it's like in other spaces. So if you're listening, you should be encouraged to have an audacity to own what ecosystem and entrepreneurship is, to help rewrite some of the metrics that are specifically advantageous to your diverse group, because historically no other group would do it for you, and to be able to be advocates, not just in political freedoms, but also in economic dreams, because that's the way then we can collaboratively truly impact the world we want to see. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The audacity. So thank you all for joining us for this session number 2 of the OECD Global Shapers Future of Work Dialogue series. We have more to come, so please do register for those as we move through this series throughout the next few months. Thanks so much to our panelists, Jonathan, Marissa, and Emmanuel, for joining us from all corners of the world. And follow us all on Twitter. We're all online and ready to engage. So thank you for your impact and investment into the future of work. And let's design one that's more purpose-driven. So have a great day.
Bye, Jonathan, Marissa, Deloris.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
Great talk. Thanks. Bye.